Great, thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much for the very kind invitation to come here. It's my delight to be here, and for all the work that went into organizing the event. I always appreciate the hidden labor that goes on behind these big events, or big for me. I appreciate it very much. So today I'm talking about beekeeping and rurality and a little bit of everything in between. So I want to start by introducing you to a poem from 1858 written by John Greenleaf Whittier in the northeastern seaboard in the United States. And I'm afraid I have to pick up my computer to read the small text. But I'll start here, telling the bees. Here is the place, right over the hill, runs the path I took, and you can see the gap in the old wall still, and the stepping stones in the shallow brook. There are the beehives, ranged in the sun, and down by the brink of the brook are her poor flowers, weeds overrun. Pansy and daffodil, rose and pink, since we parted a month had passed, to love a year. And before them, under the garden wall, forward and back, went drearily singing the chore girls small, draping each hive with a shred of black. Trembling I listened, the summer sun had the chill of snow, for I know she was telling the bees of one gone on a journey we all must go. But her dog whined low on the doorway still. With his cane to his chin, the old man sat, and the chore girl still sung to the bees stealing out and in. And the song she was singing ever since in my ear sounds on. Stay home, pretty bees, fly not hence. Mistress Mary is dead and gone. And so this is sort of a tradition within beekeeping called Tell It to the Bees, where beekeepers tell their bees of different happenings in the home. So it's an old tradition. Where it comes from is not quite known. Some say it's from Celtic traditions. We don't really know. But the idea is that your bees know who the beekeeper is, that you have this relationship with them, and they know who is in the house. So you must tell your bees when someone dies, when someone's born, when someone's married, when someone's sick, that the bees have an interest in the home. And the bees are not just stock out in the yard, but rather part of the story of your day-to-day life. So I want you to kind of, as we go through talking about bees and digital geographies, kind of think about this social relation and this long tradition going back many years between the beekeeper and the bees. And as Cornelia already said, I'm here today presenting on a project called Digital Nature, Everyday Social Technical Relations and Practices within Sweden's rural agriculture and wild harvesting industries. And there are 4 of us in the project. Qian Zhang is our principal investigator at Stockholm University. There's me from Örebro University, Lynn Axelsson from Linköping University, and Shengnan Han from the Stockholm University at the Department of Computer and System Sciences. So they all send their greetings, and we're very happy to be working together on this newly funded project, which has just started. And the scope of our project is to understand the role of platformization in the changing social technical relations in everyday rural work and life. And we really want to emphasize in our project this idea of work and daily life, primarily through the nature-based industries. And then because of its funding, we're also interested in questions of sustainability and equality. But we're particularly interested in sort of defining that along the eyes of equality in terms of rural, social, spatial justice, these kinds of questions. And to do this, we're looking at it in 3 ways. Beekeeping, which is the project that I'm involved in. I myself am a hobbyist beekeeper. Sadly, not at the moment. My bees did not make it through this really harsh winter. So that was really sad for me. But new bees are ready. They're coming soon, which is always an exciting day when you have to drive with a beehive in the back of your car. So we're not looking forward to that day, but I'm looking forward to once again having bees on the property, because I was thinking this weekend when it was so beautiful and sunny and my bees weren't there, I was actually very sad. I had this sort of longing for my bees to be there. But we're also looking at agrotourism, so looking at wolf and other sort of agricultural tourism and farming along those lines, and then the wild berry industry. So how is digital geographies incorporated in that? So today I'll be focusing primarily on beekeeping and the agricultural industries. So today's talk is a little bit messy, I think, much sticky like honey, kind of gets everywhere, gets on your hands and all over the place. But I'm going to be talking about what how do we think or conceptualize rural and digital geographies? And I'll be talking about a paper which Qian and I and Shengnan published quite recently. And then through two examples that are very much work in progress. They're at the early stages. So if you have comments or suggestions for improvement, that's very much welcome. And sort of focusing on how that can be for digital geographies. And then hopefully you'll have questions that we can discuss and suggestions for me for improving it. But for the main takeaways today, I think what I want to sort of explore with you is the idea of how does context shape our understanding of digital spaces and places. And what I'm going to argue is that a lot of our thinking in digital geography has really been coming from the direction of digitality rather than spatial contexts. And so what we're trying to do in our project is think about what happens when we say that context and the social practices of a specific place, how does that change how we understand digital spaces and places? And how much is this is part of a continuum? So we want to explore in the project and also through these examples is how much sort of thinking about digital space as a continuum that's very much tied to a contextualized spatial arrangement. What does that actually mean in terms of thinking about rural digital geography? We also want to argue that rural areas are unique, that we do need perhaps a specific understanding for digitality in rural spaces. And I'll get to a bit more on that why. And I also want to explore a little about what happens when we start to think about the theorization of digital geographies, not from the urban perspective, which I think has become very embedded in digital geographies. For example, we have the term platform urbanism, right? And we just kind of use that without even questioning why is it urbanism? So what we want to do in the project is just think like, okay, maybe it is an urban phenomena, but what happens if we don't take that for granted? What does that mean in terms of our thinking? And then thinking about then what would a rural digital geography look like? And I don't think I have an answer directly for you today, but perhaps that's something we can tease out and think about more. So that's kind of what to expect and my main arguments for today. So if you keep those in mind as I move through the examples. So I want to start with rural geographies, which is, I know we have a couple of rural geographers in here, but it's almost like saying, what is the history of geography itself? I mean, rural geography has this long tradition. It's very hard to pin down. I mean, it's co-constructed, I think, with the history of geography. But I think that there is something interesting, sort of quantitatively and qualitatively, about thinking about rural spaces and what they mean in terms of understanding these spatial relations. And of course, Halfacree is one of the great thinkers of rural geography. And he argues, of course, that we can understand rural geography through sort of these three, I guess, lens or pinpoints, right? So there's the rural locality, which is the place that we actually are, perhaps like this room. Then there's representations of the rural. So thinking about what is the rural, how does that shape what we understand and how we make spaces. So a lot of this, if we think about sort of the nation state and perhaps sort of national identities, what does the rural actually mean? How does that contrast to what life actually is in rural areas? And then, of course, the lives of rural. So what does it mean to actually live in these spaces and places? And how do they then all intersect together? So basically, what we see here is then is rural geography, like all other geographies, is sort of a social construction of different layers of spaces and meanings. But what does that leave us when we start to think about digital geographies? Where does digital geography fit into these arrangements? Is it, more aligned with one or the other? Is it in of itself something special? Is digital geography really have nothing to do with rural? Look, I mean, we hear this kind of counter argument that, it doesn't really matter if you bring your computer to your summer house, isn't that just the same as urban living? Or is there something distinctly different? And I think it's just worth asking the question, is it something distinctly different or not? And one of the reasons that we came to these questions is that Qian Zhang and I had a project on the gig economy. And as one does, we say that you're going to do these different things, and one of them was we wanted to see what the gig economy looked like in rural areas. And when we started looking, we realized very quickly that we had put the cart before the horse, that there's not a lot on the rural areas in the gig economy. And the explanation was, well, they just aren't big enough to sustain gig workers, right? Like for a Fedora driver, it doesn't really make sense. But Qian and I were never particularly comfortable with that explanation. We wanted to know well, is there more? Especially in the pandemic, we saw sort of this explosion of the gig economy. So that was a little bit where we were coming from when we started to think about this gig economy, labor, geographies, platformization. But both of us had backgrounds in rural geography. So it was a little bit like coming home, trying to figure that out. So if we start to think about then, where does the digital geography fit in? It becomes quite complicated thinking about digital geographies. And of course we have the great sort of the digital turn from 2018, where Ashwood and others were writing about, well, the digital geography is as sort of human geographers tend to do, the in and of and through practices and specialities. So digital geography kind of runs anywhere from sort of the hardware, the infrastructure, the materialization of these, all the way to how do we build meaning and social practices in there. And Osborne and Jones have written in their very nice new book, I strongly recommend reading it, A Research Agenda for Digital Geographies, that digital geography is this heterogeneous flow as a spectrum, that this sort of past way of thinking about digital geography is sort of the digital space and the physical space, that we can't really think like that anymore. They're much more messy and they come together. And Merrill is building along that idea as well when he argues that digital geographies, our spaces and places are more or less digital, right? So sometimes we're more digital and sometimes we're less digital, but that digital geography is now a center pillar in how we live and move through our lives. And we can kind of see that in just kind of this moment. We're more or less in physical space, we're all together here, but we're making a film for YouTube, which will then be digitalized. So we can see already kind of that spectrum moving through how do we think about that. And of course, Donna Haraway in 1985 was thinking way ahead of everybody on these issues and offered the idea of the cyborg, which was this idea that our bodies and our experiences and our emotions and the sort of material ways of doing labor and social activities would become more and more integrated and intertwined. And she wrote in 1985 sort of the cyborg as the disassembled and reassembled postmodern collective and personal self. So really thinking about the ways in which digital spaces are comprised of our own individual actions, but much like a beehive, also this collective idea of how we move through spaces. And I'll get back to sort of thinking about that metaphorically as well. But increasingly too, people have been interested in digital geographies, and this is a little bit my own personal interest as well, is the role of emotions, atmospheres, and embodiment in digital geographies. So how do we also create not just things that we do, but how does that create a mood and an emotion, a way of understanding our interactions in digital geographies? And I argue in a paper that just got accepted this morning, I'm very happy, that in fact these emotions in digital spaces are connective and continuative. So it comes from our bodies through our phones, but that these spaces and places are not separate things on a spectrum, rather that they need to all kind of work together and flow together in order to understand. So we have kind of, and I think it's just sort of representative of the newness of the field, very wide, sort of loosey-goosey, for many reasons, understandings of what digital geography is. I think as a field we haven't quite settled on different sort of schools of thoughts. But I think Ettlinger has raised a really important question in her book on algorithm governance on what is the role of context in digital spaces. And in there, she's been making the argument that in all of our excitement about digital technologies and digital opportunities, that perhaps we're forgetting about the fact that these devices are actually situated in space. And they're not just situated because we have them in our hand or on our body in some way, but they're situated in contextualized spaces. And I found this to be very interesting around thinking around rural areas, which rural geographers have always been trying to argue, no, rural matters. Rurals are really important. We're not just not cities. We're more than this. And so I think there's a lot of parallel between this discussion of what is the role of context in digitalization and rural geography's sort of push to sort of settle the importance of rural areas within that. So Jian and I and Shengnan, we started to think about this of how do we start to understand rural geographies and digital geography together, and what is the literature actually saying around these topics. And so we decided to bring our different interests together. Shengnan works at the Department of Computer Science computer and data science at Stockholm University, and we started to work together to conduct a global literature review. So she was able to access, through her machine learning, every article in the world written about rural and digital spaces. And so we brought this together in the newly published, just in a couple months ago, Technology and Society, trying to understand what rural studies is. And we ran the machines, and then Chian and I, as sort of rural people, looked at them to try and understand what was the machine coming. And we came to a cluster of 10 topics, which I won't go into so much detail here. The paper's available, and I really welcome you to read it. I would enjoy that very much. But what we found basically is that we don't understand digital from a rural perspective at all, more or less. That we have this urban normative grounding in all of the ways that we think about it. And in fact, we started with 4,000. I think our final study had, please don't quote me, but I think had about 400 and something in it. And very few, maybe one or two, actually had rural context as a centralized concept in discussing rural and digital geography. And so what we argue through a long, sort of convoluted way is that digital is always situated sort of outwardly. So the way in which we talk about it as sort of a social and regional development or business economic is something like the state says that rural areas need this or these kinds of questions. Or when they do come from bottom up, sort of more community, they're situated as individual experience and community building. There's very little that actually has this sort of focus on, well, what does it actually mean to be a person living in rural areas and how do they use it other than sort of the state? And I think an easy example would be things like healthcare. There's a huge sector I'm looking at. The problem with rural areas is that the people live far away from hospitals, and the easy solution is to get them online. Right? But there's very little consultation in the articles about what would that mean for rural communities. What does a daycare maybe mean for these kinds of things? Beyond the sort of the dominant discourse of, well, people are leaving the rural areas, there's nowhere, there's not the population and so on and so forth. I think you're pretty familiar with this. But what we also discovered is that there's very little being written on rural and digital studies, actually. It's a bit harder to see in the room, but the top table is the number of publications from 2010 to 2021. And yeah, we can see that there's an increased interest in rural and digitalization. But in 2021, the biggest year, there were still only 132 articles globally, which for those of us know how many articles are being published on any topic. It's pretty low. We were overwhelmed at first when we had this data set of thousands of articles, but once we started to narrow it down, we were like, actually, there's not many people writing on this. And then we did a distribution of globally where they're being published. So Asia is here, Asia with 152 publications, Europe, North America, Africa, Oceania, South America, and non-specified. And it was very interesting, actually. We realized as we were geotagging all the articles, how many people felt it was unnecessary to say what country this rural area was in. That was a big sort of surprise and a bit of a skeptical finding for us, that somehow even being rural, you just didn't even belong to a state. You were just out there. We thought that was very interesting. We also had a lot of challenges with North America, where articles from the United States also didn't identify as the United States. They would just say the state or something interesting. So there was it took quite a lot of labor just to kind of go through and identify where all these articles were from. And we also have a qualitative section where we look at all the articles from the Nordic region, as they're sort of because of our expertise of knowing Nordic areas, but also because Nordic areas are a little unrepresentative in how well grounded they are in rural studies. Let me repeat that. They are well grounded in rural studies, and they also have lots of digital tools. We're very well covered if we compare to Canada, where I come from. You're an hour outside of Toronto and the internet doesn't work. These kind of questions. And it's a very big political question in a way that it isn't here. So we thought the Nordics were an interesting place to explore these concepts a little bit more deeply. But what we found, kind of the most important thing to take away from this article, is that there's this urban normative conceptualization. We see rural very much as a problem that can be solved through digital technical infrastructure, but also that this is something that should come into rural areas rather than rural areas necessarily advocating it as sort of a global norm. And just to give you a little look, we ran through, this is what sort of a keyword network map when we ran through all the articles through Voss Viewer, which is just sort of a machine learning tool readily available. And you can see different clusters. This is kind of a dirty science. If you run it again, you'll get different clusters and things. But what we thought was so interesting was things like the digital divide and digital literacy and things really stood out in terms of the way in which we're thinking about rural areas. You can see here we have broadband data, rural economy, sort of different places. But there's really just not a lot on the experience of using rural technologies in a rural space. What does it mean to use these things? And we were very surprised by this. And here's just an example of two of the global topics that we talk about. I won't spend a lot of time in them. I just wanted to show two of them. The first was innovation and smart development, which isn't probably overly surprising in terms of thinking about where it's important. And you can see it's a growing topic. And then our topic number 8 was information, public access and usage. And it's largely declining as a topic, but a lot on, do you have access to the internet? Can you get information? Are there libraries where you can get it from? Are there schools able to use it? These kinds of questions. But this is all kind of outlined in the paper. The things to take away for us today is that what we're interested in thinking about is sort of different kinds of digital divide, not just thinking about do you have actually access, which of course is a very important question, but how do we as researchers theoretically steer the discussion away from sort of social technical life in rural areas? And how do we maybe undermine rural geographies and rural lives in doing that as researchers ourselves? And so what we argue is that rural has been neglected as a conceptualization in digital geographies and the theorization of digital geographical spaces. And then if that's the case, what are the potentialities then for understanding this? How do we think about it? What does platformization mean in a rural area? And we think that this will lead to a better understanding socially, politically, economically for rural lives, that we think about this in a spatial context. So that's a little bit of the background and framing for thinking about this. So I want to take you to a first example, which is the idea of thinking about producing the rural through agri-tourism. So we're interested in digital tourism and basically city folks coming to rural areas to experience it. And what do they think about that? How do we create digital atmosphere and emotions in digital spaces? And what does this imagining and gazing digitally at the rural, what does it do in terms of how we construct and think about the rural, and maybe for the rural, I think in this case, and how is this part of creating a spatial digital geography? So again, this is an early project. We're currently writing it up, but what we've done is an Instagram analysis of a tourist hashtag, a very popular hashtag, and we've taken 20 to 30 photos that show up on a certain specific, the algorithm is always changing, so we were struggling with how do you do this? Because if you do too much research, you end up changing the algorithm and then your results get funny. So it's quite a sort of little bit of a technical difficulties, but we have a snapshot of different photos of the hashtag, and we're thinking about the hashtag as a digital marker, not just as a sort of the concept of an idea, but a marker of the digital gaze, but also as a kind of geographic site. So as a place in which rural is being made actively through collective actions. And so here's our findings, more or less. So we have the 30, I say 20, but it's actually 30. I'm a qualitative researcher, so these things are often challenging. I apologize for that mistake. But what we started to do was code each of the images, trying to figure out what was in them. And so the text is awfully small, I'm sorry. But we have on the top row seasonality. And what we see almost right away, nobody takes a picture of yucky weather. It's always sunny in rural areas. We have one winter day or 2 winter days. Animals. So animals are very popular, and not just any animals, but attractive young animals. So there are so many kittens. Which I have always enjoyed, but You can see there's kittens here, young goats, young chicks, nobody, none of the unpleasant side of farm life on that side. And then we have the two in the middle row, interior and exterior. So what was inside a house and what was outside a house, and food. People love to eat in rural areas, and they love to eat fresh food, none of this yucky processed stuff. It's all nice food, a lot of trees, grasses, and of course farm facilities. So you can see here we kind of right away start to think about different kinds of images. And one thing we thought was so interesting with the hashtag is there was no water. Even though we were doing Sweden, I had in my little code book that there was going to be water, people jumping in. This is what I thought. No, not at all. Lots of happy sunny days, but no water. So we started with thinking about what do these photos, what does this mean? And we can start to see right away that we have a very specific gaze of rural. And then we started to do a content analysis, again, of 30 photos, of trying to think about atmosphere and how atmosphere is made sort of through this sort of ongoing individuals uploading of the hashtag, but also then how does it become part of a collective experience? And so we wanted to know was sort of this calm atmosphere and an exciting atmosphere. And I haven't put like a scale because this is very much a qualitative assessment. But basically, if it was a calm picture like a sunset, somebody's feet off into the distance and exciting, like a party. And then we had positive and negative. So was the feeling sort of one of this is a positive experience or a negative experience? And if we start to go through and think about the hashtag, it's overwhelmingly positive. In the ones that we pulled forward, there were very little negative there, and either calm or very exciting, right? These were all quite evenly displayed, but nonetheless quite emotive. That the interaction of posting, we weren't posting, or people weren't posting mundane photos, but rather things that were communicating some sort of gaze about the rural, right? And of course, this is for a tourist hashtag, but these are being posted mostly by tourists, not by the companies are not them. So what we've done then is we tried to make an archetype of the different analysis. And one of the reasons we're doing this, of course, is for ethics. Not to be posting people's photos from Instagram, but also because engaging with the photos, trying to reconstruct and think about the photos in of themselves is a form of analysis. Harriet Haraway has talked a lot in her research about the purpose of art, not just as a delivery and a form of communication, but as a way of thinking with and through different data. So we started to construct these different archetypes. So in archetype 1, this is this interior that I was pointing out before. Almost always it was a picture of a bed. There's so many pictures of rural beds, which if you grow up in a rural area may be very contrary to your experience. And almost always a window. So preferably a bed by the window with the sun shining in. You can kind of get the mood. Maybe a table with food, like good wholesome food. But very much this sort of warm, clean, festive, and very traditional. A lot of darlana, the wooden beds, these kind of things. And the second archetype, which was outside, so many pictures with animals, particularly cats. Cats, as I said earlier, were really popular. Young cats. Cats are always eating cake and helping with chores and in the barn and doing all these things. A high level of alcohol, wine, beer, enjoying their times, goats and barns, and again, always sunny, always kind of a summer day. And in the third, we have this sort of these big landscape photos with usually the house sort of centered, and then the big landscape. And so what we started to think about is the way in which this particular iconography thinks about the rural, not just as a place of consumption or as a gaze, but also sort of a completely detached digital space from any sort of rural experience that perhaps somebody living or there full time might be doing. And so what we're arguing in this paper is very much this idea of the hashtag as a process of making digital spaces and places, and not just that this is sort of an intrusive sort of incoming idea around the hashtag, but also that this is kind of a spatialization of rural ideas, that this is not just a fleeting idea on Instagram, but rather something that is in fact rooted to specific ideas and identities of rural space and place, and mediated through those ideals and representations. If we think about this. There. Just keeping my eye on time. So then I want to turn to sort of different social technical relations through beekeeping. And I wanted to a lot of people don't know what bees actually are. I get a lot of sort of talking about bees as pointing to wasps and hornets, but bees that we keep are honeybees generally. This is a little worker bees, and they live in hives. There's a queen bee, which as a feminist geographer I quite enjoy, and the workers with different roles there. And so there's the worker bees, there's the nursery bees, the bees who go out. This is a bee who's out scavenging. And drones, who are basically bachelors who live in the hive and party all summer, eating honey and getting drunk, and then they get thrown out in the fall. So the male bees don't get to stay. There's some very interesting discussions around this, sort of in Women in Beekeeping, and lots of photos of these drones getting dragged out of the hives come winter. But there's a very complex society, honeybees. A typical hive is usually 30,000 to 60,000. I saw on the BBC News yesterday that there was an article saying a girl thought she had a monster in her room, but it was 60,000 bees. And I was like, yeah, but that's a bee society. We don't need to be so dramatic. Not that it would be nice to have bees in your room, but the media often portrays it as like this huge number. But it's like, yeah, that's a society. That's how many are in a sort of honeybee hive. Bumblebees, by contrast, are usually about 150 to 200 and have a very different kind of society that they live in. But bees, they like to live in a place. They can stay, hives can stay in a place for a really long time, and it's quite complex. So what is beekeeping? Beekeeping is, in principle, the keeping and having and maintaining of bees. Sort of providing shelter for the bees that they will want to stay, and then the beekeepers provide that shelter. They should do things like swarm management. So bees, that's how bees reproduce. They swarm. New queen takes over the remaining hive, and the queen flies away. Right? Overwintering, a lot of domesticated bees need help to get through the winter. There's a lot of debate around how we do this. I don't know if there are any other beekeepers in the room, but there's kind of the standard joke that if you ask one beekeeper, you'll get 10 answers on how to do these things. So if there's another beekeeper, I don't want to start a controversy, but there's a lot of discussion about how you overwinter them. Disease and mite control. And disease and mite control are sort of, with climate change, increasingly important part of beekeeping. And your typical beekeeper, they harvest honey, which means removing of honey, usually twice a year, end of June, August. And if you're doing it well, you don't usually harm the bees. You're taking the honey. Beeswax, pollen, royal, jelly, and propolis. These are all different things that you can take from your bees. And the benefit of having bees, apart from the delicious yumminess of honey, is that they pollinate. So they fly around and they go. I've had a neighbor come and complain, where are the bees? My apple trees are about to bloom, where are your bees? Because they're not on property yet. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about beekeeping in general is that it ranges from these big businesses you've probably heard of, like the bee transport trucks that take people out to like these hives, to almond farms, and then the hobbyists. But hobbyists is a huge proportion of beekeeping. But also beekeeping is this social, intimate, and spiritual and relational practice. For a lot of beekeepers, hobbyists, this is a very special sort of relationship that they often have with their bees. Queens often have names, things like that. That it's not just sort of this simple passing, animal on your farm. And how does one become a beekeeper or a bee haver? Is generally you took courses and you had mentors, right? So you had someone down the road who would help you out and you would learn from them. Now you can do as many like online courses and groups, and this is something that we're going to look at more in the project itself. But there's also a lot of discussion of crisis within the beekeeping community, right? It's very much a hobby that's marked by crisis. Climate change is a huge impact on it. We have a lot of hive collapse. It was a very bad winter in Sweden for bees. My hives did not make it through the deep freeze, but also the spread of disease. So we have diseases that are moving further north, coming up into Swedish beekeeping, but also sort of this monolithic agricultural is very hard on bees as well, if you have monocropping, these kind of things. So within the field itself, it's quite different, but there's sort of this kind of collective idea that there's less local knowledge, there's less often the person down the road where you could ask the question, and more moving online to get to these kind of questions. But also increasingly, the idea that a lot of these issues can be fixed through digital solutions and digital processes and different sort of digital practices. So really thinking about, okay, what we need is better data, better systems. This is sort of the issue with bees in terms of thinking about this. At the same time, I think we think about honey, not just as something that's yummy and delicious, but also as a digital social relation. So that how does honey sort of move through? Honey itself here is just sort of this sort of sticky mass of sugars going together. And then here is how you can this is a photo from my house of, you can sort of manually scrape the honey off, and it's this sort of arduous labor of scraping, and then it gets caught in the net, and then it drips through another net, and then you get lots of honey. This bucket would probably be about 30 kilos or something of honey. But I think it's useful to also think about honey not just as sort of the yummy thing, but this digital relation, this thing that sticks us together and starts to raise different kinds of questions about thinking about this. And so a lot of sort of technical solutions have been thought about in terms of not only digital agriculture, but thinking about bees and how we manage our honey, and how do we think about taking care of our hives as a digital solution. And again, this raises kind of this question of where are these social relations coming from in terms of beekeeping? So we have this, I think, a really nice article by Hewitt et al. Looking at sort of digital agriculture, which applies to all sorts of different aspects around agriculture and farming. But thinking about the role of data, cloud computing, AI, simulation, robots, all of these things. So digital technology can be used in a lot of different ways around beekeeping. It can be used for detecting the queen. Usually when you do an inspection, which is the beekeeper's job, you should go into the hive and you want to find the queen. And it's extremely difficult to find a queen. We're back to like 60,000 bees, and there's one queen, and she moves around. It's very hard to find. So you can use AI, for example, to find this queen, but also trying to do sort of different external events, sort of robbing, which is when another hive wants to steal your honey, swarms, which is when your bees come up and fly away, but also thinking about winter conditions. This is, for most beekeepers, a very stressful time. Are your bees going to make it through the winter? But also there's digital spaces in terms of learning and sharing, mentoring, and social relations. And I'm sorry that it's so small. I didn't realize that it would be so small, but there's endless apps that you can connect to see about your hives. And so this here is an example of different tasks that you can do on this specific app, which I'm not necessarily advocating for, but I put here as an example, sort of find the queen, and it can do AI imaging, for example, to find the queen. But also for figuring out and deciding what is your foragery, because I think one of the things that's very interesting about beehives is your beehive may be sitting in a specific place or a specific context, but every day those bees, that little worker bee that I showed earlier, gets up and flies away. And so now you can use sort of digital technologies to figure out your forage area. So I did one here for just the center of Karlstad, which you will know better than I what that covers, but you can see, I think, quite a large extent that one hive will be covering and probably meeting other bees, which is where we get into these questions of disease control and all of these questions, because a bee can do about 3 to 5 kilometers from their hive as their foraging area. So it's kind of this interesting spatial relation where they are contained to one spot, but they cover a fair bit of ground. And when we're thinking about then digital geography and getting back to that idea of digital spaces being a continuum, we start to think about smart hives. It's interesting to start to play with a little bit, well, where is the spatialities of this hive when we start to bring in digital technologies? This sort of internal data, what's going on in the hive, but also external data and sort of thinking about how do we make our different decisions, how are we spatializing them. And at the same time, this very heavy push towards digitalization in terms of technical infrastructure problems, which Tian and Shengnan and I highlighted as sort of this grounding in digital studies. I'm thinking about digital geographies as something that can easily be solved through digital technologies. And I think one of the things that we want to study more, and hearing more about, here they call it in their model, which I really like this article, but they call the beehiver here as this local intelligence. But I'm wondering about the social technical relations within that. What is the role of the beekeeper, not just as sort of a processor or using of these digital spaces, but of something creating sort of specific geographies through beekeeping, and what does that mean? And so what they write here, Hewitt, they say, in terms of smart beehives, they write, the goal is to help different stakeholders to make the best decisions. So by stakeholders, I think they mean beekeepers. We studied through a spatial temporal matrix with the time and geographical horizons, all kinds of decisions that can be made. And I think this is just really interesting that we're talking a lot about geography in terms of hive management and hive engagement, but not about the social technical processes. What does it mean, not only for the beekeeper, but maybe for this relationship that people have with their bees and the bees themselves as part of these relations. So one of the things that we want to explore more is thinking of beekeeping as a process in digital spaces, something that's a spatialized product with an embedded geography and that requires specific geographical knowledge. So you need to know, like, what are those trees? What is the weather? But also acknowledging the ways in which hives are rooted in and to and through different spaces and places, but are again mediated through these kinds of digitalities. What are the roles of how do we learn? And who do we ask in terms of building these things? And thinking about hives as a digital process, as something that is networked, connected, flowed, and assemblage, both through the digitalities, but also through the day-to-day, as the honey flows through the hives, as is part of the assemblage of bee communities, and also the sort of social lives of the people living in and around the hive themselves. So very quickly, I know I'm getting a bit slow on time, but thinking about continuums and returning to the theorization of digital geographies, I think it's useful to start to think about where are the bees? Where are they located? Who is the central social technical relation in shaping these things? And why are these kind of questions important to ask? We think about beehives as a sort of a digital geography. We have, sort of the classic geographical questions. Of course, we have there's my beehive there on the tree, a lovely sunny day. I have adhered to the presentation of Rural. But it's in Sweden, right? It's in a specific state structure, different kind of context, sort of different ways of shaping and understanding rurality, but an increasingly part of this spectrum of digital spaces and places. To be honest, sometimes it's easier for me to go onto the Canadian beekeeper websites and get information for cold weather bees than it is to perhaps ask a beekeeper like in Southern Europe for advice. So there's very interesting geographies for us to think about it. And if we turn to sort of that hashtag, thinking about the representations of different kinds of rules, we can think about the ways in which we represent and connect different ideas. How is that part of these wider social relations, the creation of different atmospheres and emotions, and of course to the actual rooted spaces and places. So thinking about not just the sort of hybrid spaces, but the ways in which they flow and become part of these processes. I think turning back to thinking about tell it to the bees and that sort of social relationship of bees being part of your household, being part of your community. It's interesting to think of beekeeping not just as the having of a hive, but as a specific type of knowledge and as a specific social relationship. That is very much geographically bounded, and that is a relation in and to different kinds of digital spaces. And so if I'm thinking back to Donna Haraway's Cyborg, this hybrid of relationship of machines, person, collective, and individual, but also bees, hives, and the different relations within that being part of it. And if we think then, if we return to Halfacree's idea of how do we understand rural spaces and thinking about rural spaces as part of that spectrum, we have that locality, the specifications of the locality, the representations of the rural and the lives of rural, also shaping these spaces, but then perhaps bringing in the digital. And I don't know if that's in the right space, but trying to think more, what is the digital as an extension of these kind of geographies? How does that matter and shape how we're considering these tasks? And so in conclusion, from these two examples and the published paper, I think what I've tried to argue today is that rural practices and representations matter in digital studies, that we need to be thinking about the context and the different relationships within that. And thinking of social relationships and agritourism and beekeeping is a way of reminding us that the social is very much part of these digital spaces, but that the social is not just the user interface and how we enter in or out of these spaces, but what is the context and meaning that we're using to create those interactions and thinking about that. And I think very much honey works as quite a metaphor in terms of thinking here, this sort of sticky, fluid spaces, but something that's also sort of yummy but not quite easy to get at. I think it's quite useful. And I think that the thinking about sort of the continuum of digital spaces, it's not all tech and it's not all play, and thinking about through this. And so what I want to do for closing is to remind you of the old man and the chore girl who sat still and sung to their bees, stealing in and out and wanting them to stay, even though Mistress Mary had passed away. So thank you so much.